and
All
welcome
right.
to the Borderlines podcast. Oh, we're both introducing.
Go for it. Go for
That's
it.
what happens when we don't call. So it's Friday, the 12th of September, and we're basically wanting to cover off some of the posts that Steve has done on LinkedIn recently about some statistics. Covering the drop off on the acceptances to the international student cap, which are pretty dramatic. And he also posted some statistics about what's been happening to acceptance rates so far in the year in permanent residency. I also wanted to talk about a recent post by our friend Lev Abramovich, which I thought was it was just kind of covering off some of the recent media posts about media articles about uh, the sudden. I feel like the media is kind of catching up with something that Steve and I have been talking about for well over a year now about, how public opinion has really dropped off for immigration in general, in keeping very much with the political loss of support for immigration in a broader way, which I think is just an interesting topic in general, and I feel like marks the kind of general turn in political sentiments both in Canada and more globally as well.
Yep. And yeah, just to be clear, when it's stats that I've posted, so that a lot of them, some of them are internally tipped, some are publicly available on the IRCC website. And let's just dive into it. Deanna and I, it just seems everything is very busy right now, so we want to try and keep this on track. As always, we'll take questions, live questions as they come in towards the end. But first, let's get into the stats a little bit of approval rates and immigration levels in 2025. And I actually want to start with a CBC article, which I think sets the tone a little bit because it talks about how, in reaction to these stats, the immigration minister's response has been to say that these reductions are a clear sign that the measures we've put in place are working. So, in other words, there's a celebration of the drop in the number of study permit approvals and international students in Canada. And when I saw that, and when you see the numbers, there was this brief moment, my dad often says, and I know he listens to the podcast, so he'll laugh when he hears me say this, but my dad often says, okay, let's stop and think. So there's a reduction in the numbers, and it makes me just wonder, like, what is the government's goal? Is the government's goal that there be a collapse in study permits numbers, or that it be a certain amount? So in January 2025, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada announced that it had published its cap for the number of study permits that would be issued this year. Since 2024, IRCC has been capping the number of study permits, and the plan was that for 2025, IRCC plans to issue a total of 437,000 study permits, which represents a 10% decrease from the 2024 cap. So that, as far as I understood, was the plan, a 10% reduction in the number of people coming as students in 2025 compared to 2024. What we have instead is a complete collapse. And so if we just look, the data is only current to June 2025, but if we just look at comparing the first 6 months of 2024 with the first 6 months of 2025, it is way more than 10%. So we just go January 2024, 27,500, I'm rounding off, students enter Canada. January 2025, 11,200, more than 50%. February 2024, 9,000. February 2025, 4,100. So again, more than 50%. March 2024, 16,875. March 2025, 3,819. My math's not great enough to know immediately if that's 75%, 80%, but it's a huge drop. April 2024, 45,800. April 2025, 8,543. Again, huge reduction, way more than 10%. And just to round it off, May 2024, 14,000. May 2025, 4,500. June 2024, 11,200. June 2025, 4,185. So we're looking basically at around, on average, 60 to 70% reduction in the
Easy.
number of students who are entering. I don't know that this was the plan. It certainly wasn't the plan that was announced in January. I feel like it's an underreported so far on just how big this drop is. I don't know
And
to
what
what
the
extent.
impacts have been on the universities, on
Yep.
the faculties, on whether or not they're going to be sustained the same level of programming, all of that sort of thing. I don't know
Yeah.
why my computer is giving this weird blowout effect, but
Yeah. To those watching on YouTube, Deanna is not a
I'm not a
ghost.
ghost. Mm.
But yeah, so a huge reduction in the overall numbers. I don't know. I mean, it creates all sorts of odd questions. Is the plan to maintain this super, super low entry? Or I think less likely, but possible, if they do want to hit their targets, does it mean there needs to be a huge increase in the number of study permits issued and approved for the rest of the year? So again, it's just something to note. Like the minister has said that, oh, this just shows that our measures are working. It's, it's, it, yes, I guess if the goal was to reduce numbers by 75%, but the plan was, as far as they published, 10%. There's been a similar reduction in the number of workers, but it's not as dramatic. It's overall around first six, like this is also the first year that they've had a cap, but worker levels, January 2024, 33,000 to about 14,000. February, 42,000 to 14,000. March, 63,000 to 18,000. April, 34,000 to 23,000. May, 36,000 to 23,000. In June, 36,000 to 24,000. Did that one a bit quicker. But it's also so it's down. It's down about 50%. It's hard to really know because of like the huge volumes of Iranians and Ukrainians who were renewing permits in 2024, how this actually breaks down temporary LMIA based work permits to international mobility program. But yeah, so there's a reduction there, as they note, 125,000 fewer new temporary workers arriving in Canada. But that collapse, to me anyways, seems less significant than the study permit numbers. And it's more explained because, postgraduate work permits are restricted. Open spousal work permits are restricted. The 200,000 to 300,000 Ukrainians who are renewing work permits have probably mostly renewed them. But again, something to watch for sure.
Hmm. The reason I make this point about what the impact is on schools is that, as most people know, international students pay, you know, three to 4 times the amount of tuition that domestic students do. And a lot of universities and colleges sort of depend on that increased tuition in order to subsidize programs for domestic students. Um, you know, that is an issue, and we know that when the caps were first introduced, that a lot of those faculty said that they're really going to struggle to maintain programs without that additional funding source. Um, the other thing is that, and I know you work a lot in this space, is that a lot of faculty members are being recruited as foreign workers. So there's that push along issue as well as to whether or not they're going to be able to attract and retain the same caliber of academics, if the number of foreign workers continues to decline.
Yep. And we did the episode last week where, the conservatives are calling essentially for the foreign worker program to be cut. I think Mark Carney has said that there'll be a reform that is coming that we'll have to obviously watch closely. But I'm really curious to see sort of the hangover effects. I don't have the stats on it, but according to CBC News, In the first half of 2025, the department received 302,000 study permit applications, which was down from 398,000 applications in the first half of 2024 compared to 2025. So certainly interest in applying for a study permit is down. You know, the government would say that just shows that our measures are working. Less people want to study here. You would probably say, what about Canada's brand? Like that seems to be a sign that people are less interested, whether that's because of increased refusal rates or because the government, word is spreading on how the government essentially misrepresented and lied to international students who are currently here about their ability to stay, and many are now leaving. If you go to Reddit, the Canadian immigration thread, it's just filled with people who are really pissed off, having spent a lot of money to study here, work here, study French last minute here in a desperate effort to stay, and now are leaving. So how
I think
long the
also
impact of
the
this is felt and how
mm,
quickly the government can turn it around remains to be seen as well.
I think also the removal of the ability for so many students to bring their spouse has a very profound effect on whether or not somebody will consider Canada as an option for a place to study. You know, especially for those wanting to, you know, undertake full degree programs. The idea of having to leave a spouse, especially when there are children involved, for a 4-year degree program and not being able to to bring family as a unit. I mean, I know for me that would be a deal breaker, and so I imagine that that would also be the case for many seeking to undertake such a significant program and at such significant cost. The idea of having to maintain homes in 2 different countries, I think, you know,
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
that
for me,
will
the big
definitely
factor would just be if people who I knew who had gone there to study were saying, uh, right now, the immigration department, I mean, like right now they're gaslighting about what they previously said,
for
but just
sure.
that it's super expensive. There's not a lot of housing. The media right now is, some would say, has just very negative
Vilifying.
portrayals or vilifying, whether it's the government for admitting too many people or the number of international workers. Certainly, the temporary foreign worker program right now is being ripped apart. And as we discussed
It's
last week,
not
a
a
lot
nice
of those
climate for
people
sure.
are working in those jobs that LMIAs are being applied for. So
Hmm.
we'll see, right? Like you can never fully forecast things, but what it takes for student numbers, both the number of applications to go back up, and I'm super curious as to like what the plan is, if they do plan on just now approving a lot of study permits to hit their targets, or if they are going to admit so few students, what the repercussions are of that, and sort of what the discourse, whether the discourse changes because the pendulum swung too far the other way.
The part that I'm finding really amusing and why I referenced that post that Lev did the other day is that people are very, very up in arms with the idea of
Do you
people
want to summarize his
potentially
post? Talk about his
replacing
post?
a Canadian or so he talks about the fact that like you know, um, that there's a value shift here. There's a shift in terms of like what are Canada's goals and like a sort of a move away from humanity. And it really appealed to me because I've been experiencing just in general. I mean, there's no doubt there's an escalation in violent incidents everywhere in the world. We're hearing it so much about it from the United States, but even just the number of violent incidents that we're experiencing here in Canada on a daily basis is it's definitely mounting. Even just the feeling of like the overall climate that you experience day to day on the streets, the number of unhoused people, like just it's a hard time, and um, the way that I'm facing this in a general way is that, like, there are no people, there are no customer services anymore. They just don't exist. So the idea that we have no issues with replacing human services with computers or chatbots, but there's an outrage about the idea of bringing in foreign workers to do jobs that Canadians should be doing. It seems to me like, you know, the idea of having, like, I'm just noticing now how unusual it is to have a phone number on a website and a human you can connect with at basically any service. You'll now be sent into this, like, a chat bot who will send you videos that you can watch in your own time to try and learn how to self-help your way through something. So this sort of idea like of replacing humans with things that don't cost anything or that cost less is something that we've kind of accepted as a society, and yet, um, I just feel like always it's that sort of sector of society, this kind of underclass in society that always takes the blame for decisions we've made to move away from certain things that we used to value. And so it just kind of struck me that this is just one of those examples. Immigrants, racially diverse people always take the brunt of our move away from more liberal ideologies. And this seems to me a perfect example of that. And this is kind of, we always see this when there's kind of a rise of more authoritarian style governance. And so I just thought that the way that he was talking about social media in general and how, the Twitterification of, like, how people get their news, it's not sort of a deep dive into information, but this kind of like headline, headline, headline without people understanding the human impact of, like, what happens when somebody moves their entire family, spends half a decade, getting established, investing all of their funds, living in a place and getting, entrenched, and then saying, no, 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 in fact, we don't want you anymore. And then now you need to go. What the impact is at a human level. And so I think this all ties together. The outrage, the scandal that now has arisen when these all were choices that were made very open-eyed, and now there's just been a pivot. Now we don't actually care. Now we think that you're a burden, and now we would like for you to leave.
Yeah, except the only thing I would kind of add is it's not now we want you to leave. We've always told you that you would be temporary and the
Yeah,
gaslighting that comes with that. I mean, the other
yeah,
one, like social media, I mean, we're segueing a bit, but like a good example of that would be with regards to the temporary foreign worker program debate. There was a Liberal MP whose name escapes me, who published an infograph, which basically said that in 2002 or the 1990s, the Liberals introduced the temporary foreign worker program. In 2006, the Conservatives greatly expanded it. In 2025, the Liberals started to shrink it. And it was just these 3 points on this infograph. And Bruce
yeah.
Anderson, who's a big political commentator and former owner, if not still owner, of a polling company, said, this is perfect. This is the best way to present information. This is ideal communications. Except then, and this all again occurs on social media, Mikhail Scudder had commented like it was completely false. That timeline was either incomplete or not correct. And yet that is those infograph snippets, something clear and visible, right? Like we will show on TikTok a lineup of darker skinned people applying for a job and say, there you go, the international student program's a mess, as if that TikTok video just demonstrates that that is what it is.
Mm,
And it's still the politician, but I think the politicians, to be honest, like it because it's simpler. It doesn't get into
yeah.
the nuances of like the temporary foreign worker program. And as we discussed last time, that breakdown of some of this is for workers who aren't here, some of this is related to points to express entry. There's a whole lot of stuff going on.
Hmm.
Um, and it is harder to motivate people to vote and support a cause based on nuanced, long form discussion like we do here
Right.
versus social media snippets and tweets.
Yeah, for sure. And especially when you might roll out a program, but then when you're also on the sidelines drumming up more systemic racism with, like, the way that you're politicking, again, there's, like you know, uh, like the right hand is not speaking with the left. And I mean, I really do. You've said it a number of times that um, the idea of bringing in new without actually dealing with the people that you have already brought in and who have not, there's been really no attempt or effort to integrate. Um, it feels really jarring.
Yeah, it's I don't know. The other comment that I've had, and I'll have to I could do a whole separate episode or a blog post on my thoughts on it, is that part of the reason why there were so many international, I don't know if it was deliberate, but like in the streets of downtown Vancouver, international students were, it seems, or international workers disproportionately bearing the brunt of the mental health crisis on our streets. Um, and I'm just curious to see, to what extent there may be a change with that if there's less international students and foreign workers working, especially in retail in downtown Vancouver. Because I think, and again, this is part of why I'm like pretty annoyed with how they're being treated, because they're working their butts off dealing with just a situation that I would not want to work in. Um, anyway, but so
Yeah.
going back to the stats, we talked about, so this reduction in study permits is being achieved in part by a collapse in the study permit approval rate. So for some context, I don't have the exact numbers of like the approval rates of study permits in, say, all the previous years, but it generally hovered, let's just take like India, a study permit approval rate from India, which is the top source country, was, 60-ish% in 2013, 2012, just going back. Generally, it's fluctuated, but it's always been globally, like for all study permit applications, above 50%. In
Mm.
the first 4 months of 2025, which is the data that I have, that number of study permit approvals has collapsed to 32% of study permit applications being approved. I would not have initially predicted this. I would have thought when they brought in the cap on the number of study permits, it would have imposed some measure of quality control in terms of who
Mm.
was applying, and that the government would not, the bureaucrats would not feel pressure to refuse. However, the approval rate has plummeted, which also speaks to a topic that we've discussed. There's been no change in the law, no change in any public policies, yet study permit approval rates are collapsing.
This is happening all across the sector, and I think this is really um, the issue that is most frustrating for immigration representatives right now is that like this applies to study permit applications, this applies to permanent residency applications like humanitarian and compassionate applications, this applies to caregiver applications. I mean, I could talk about a whole bunch of different categories where without any change in the law, the approval rate has tanked. And so there's no substantive difference in terms of what rules are being applied or what policies are being applied. It's just, for example, the test for whether or not somebody would remain beyond the end of the period authorized for their stay is being applied in a different manner. And so normally you would be able to make an argument that there would be a legitimate expectation that like this is not the way that the policy has been applied in the past, that somehow there's like this discretion is being applied in a different manner that it had been in the past. But how do you establish that? It's something that is almost impossible to prove on evidence because you can show statistics, but again, there's no way of actually establishing that if it had been decided in a different year, that decision would have been reached in a different way. But it raises real rule of law issues because um, there's nothing different about the case. It's just that it's now being decided on a harsher standard. Um, and, it's very confusing for anybody to know and appreciate what the test is to be met.
Oh, and the quality, and I mean, there's a lot going on at once. Like we could talk about whether layoffs at IRCC are impacting the decision. We could talk about the use of Chinook. I can say, our office recently saw there's a visitor record application for someone whose purpose of being in Canada was to attend an admissibility hearing, right? So that's something that is scheduled by the Immigration Refugee Board. And their visitor record application, the internal refusal notes consisted of the client has had ample time to achieve their purpose of visit dash attending admissibility hearing. And I can see the face you're making where it's just like, you guys schedule it. Like, this is completely beyond the person's control. But to me, it's just evidence that like these applications aren't being read, because I don't believe a human would have written something like that. I think stuff is just getting pulled from fields in the form, which I think is also contributing to the increased refusal rate, probably across all sectors.
Yeah. And like, to make the matter worse, and we've talked about this again quite a bit, you can't just go to federal court and say, "Hi, I'd like to challenge this decision. It makes no sense," because it takes 2 months to even get that document filed, let alone appear before a judge, which is likely a 2-year endeavor. And in that
Yeah.
amount of time, like, can you get that hearing at the immigration division postponed pending that, or will they just make that decision in absentia,
And yet,
Um,
ironically, federal court may be the only way to get a human to look at something.
yeah,
I've
exactly.
had, and I'm sure you've had, where someone may file a application, you look at the refusal, you think this is unreasonable, they file a reconsideration request, the reconsideration officer says everything was pitch patch the first time, and then DOJ will consent and everything will work out. And without that judicial review, I'm starting to wonder like if DOJ is increasingly the only time a human is actually getting involved. Like, I
Yeah,
really do want, and if anyone is listening, like Deanna and I have been musing about doing an episode on how the cuts are impacting things. There was a fascinating thread on Reddit, Canada Public Servants, where a bunch of anonymous DOJ lawyers were describing how new DOJ hires are facing the brunt of all the cuts there. But it really would be like, I've got some A tips on who's getting cut, but to actually know how this is impacting things, I think would be super interesting.
yeah. And we do know that the latest round of contract hires in the Department of Justice were not kept on, and I'm certain that that was due to budget cuts as well.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So like, again, they are not even able to retain their existing complement, even though it's patent that with their existing complement of lawyers, with that is going to be reduced invariably, that they're not even able to look at some of the files, um, at the point that they would be considering offering settlement. And so
Hmm.
they're even just filing like letters saying, "We're not going to respond at this time. We'll wait until the court has a chance to have a look at it, and then we'll take a look later," just because of capacity issues. That's only going to
Yeah.
get worse.
I spoke with someone at the registry. The media had said that because it's the courts that they're independent and they're not impacted by the work force adjustment. The WFA is the acronym is for the layoffs at the federal government. But this registry officer was saying they're getting cut 10%. So we'll see. It will be interesting, if not unfortunate, times ahead. I think, well, we've talked about it on the show, 2025 to 2027. We are now probably about 25% through what I think will be a rough, difficult 2 years.
Wow.
Um, but we'll get to some optimism maybe in a bit, or at least approaches people can take. I just want to work through some of these stats in the
Mm.
interests of time. Again, work permit applications, our approvals are down everywhere. Work permits overall, 69% approval rate within the temporary foreign worker program. Work permit extensions within that same program, is only a 49% approval rate. I would imagine that that's because LMIAs aren't getting approved. And so again, that 49% approval rate, if I am right, it's 51% of people who are trying to extend their work permit are unable to do so because the employer is having issues with obtaining a labor market impact assessment, often because the processing time is so long at over a year.
Right.
Canadian experience class continues to be
But also, if
high.
I can just add there that
Yep.
they're not holding applications in abeyance the way that they once were. So,
Mhm.
like, I mean, that's what I hear. I don't really do work permits, so, but at least that's what I'm hearing from friends that are solicitors, that they used to, like, they would allow you to file in advance, and they would kind of tolerate the fact that you can say this application is being filed. We have an LMIA application that's in process. Please allow another department of the Canadian government more time because they're backlogged to process that before you reject this application. And what I understand,
Yeah.
not just with those specific types of applications, but even like somebody who's being sponsored in the spousal category who wants to apply for a work permit but doesn't yet have the acknowledgement of receipt letter, like all sorts of things like
The
that, where
bridging
they,
work permits are the big one where this is
all of
happening.
them, that they
No,
won't
but the bridge
now.
used to have an explicit policy to hold it in abeyance
Yeah.
pending
I think
the receipt of the acknowledgement or receipt of the permanent residence, and they are no longer doing that.
So I'm just finding in all sorts of categories like that where they would allow somebody to just kind of hold things while they were waiting for other things from other, either from IRCC themselves or from Service
Mhm.
Canada. They're now just refusing them. And
Yeah, I
so
would
I think
still
that's going to
recommend that
impact.
people submit those requests for extension because I think the likelihood of the department actually considering it in writing in a decision is close to zero, which would make for a pretty straightforward judicial review. With the caveat, though, that, as you said, that's a lengthy process. Can't
Yeah.
work if it's a work permit extension during that time. But submitting the request for extension at least has the potential, because I don't think the department would even consider it or like in writing address it, of preserving judicial review and something that DOJ probably would consent to.
Yeah. I
Um,
agree with all that. I'm just seeing a lot of clients who have not had positive results. And I've even seen one client who applied for an extension on something else, and was denied an extension and then denied leave. So, I mean, we're
oh
seeing all
wow.
sorts of bizarre outcomes. And they even provided
Leave
good
for
reasons
those wondering, when
why.
Deanna says denied leave, she's not saying the person was denied the ability to leave the country. Leave is denied the first stage of a federal court judicial review where a judge essentially orders a hearing and determines
So
that a
it
case
means that
has
their
merit.
judicial review wasn't allowed to go forward. So the decision to deny an extension was held to be reasonable, essentially. And so the matter ended. This was on a permanent residence application, but I was quite shocked to see, all these things we've just taken for granted, that if you request an extension and explain why you need an extension, it was denied. So we're all just sort of more on, there are things that we just kind of took for granted, those basic courtesies, and I'm not finding those basic courtesies to exist. And so we're kind of more on pins and needles in terms of what we can expect from the department in terms of like just basic human courtesies.
Yep. Self-employed class, 32%. Startup visa, 23%. Insanely low.
Yeah.
Um, Federal skilled worker express entry, 78%, which apparently are mainly the francophones. So there's a certain irony in this, and some ATIPs confirm that one of the ironies is apparently refusals in the francophone category are higher than other areas of express entry. So they have to invite more and more francophones because in part of the higher refusal rate, as well as people not arriving.
Oh, wow.
And it's kind of understandable for those who don't, like the Canadian experience class for people inside Canada. You just have to show essentially 1 year of skilled work experience that wasn't self-employment. Federal skilled worker, you've got to show that you get, in addition to the express entry points, 67 points out of 100 in a grid using foreign work experience where the reference letters can be more complicated, because arranged employment points, if someone doesn't have them, they also have to show settlement funds. So there's just more grounds that someone could refuse the application. but there is just some irony that the program or the people that they're most targeting also just has a lower approval rate. Parent and grandparent is 82%. That does not include bounces. None of these stats include bounces because, as you may know from the jurisprudence, these talk about application refusals, and an incomplete application technically is not an application. And finally, the stat that I think Deanna was talking about before we went on air, the humanitarian and compassionate class approval rate has dropped to about 23%, which is low. And that category, I've seen some online posts that seem to be blurring asylum claims with H&C applications, but this is just humanitarian and compassionate class claims. So what we have is just an overall reduction in approval rates going into the bottom half of this year. So for those, I don't want this episode to be all doom and gloom, but the basic, uh, the basic, approach that I think one has to take is preparing as strong an application as possible, just because the department is right now extremely scrutinous of applications. There is, of course, this possibility that even if you prepare the perfect application, it's going to be refused by some sort of triage system. But it is just, if you want to apply to either travel, work, study, immigrate to Canada, all you can really do is submit the best application that you can, especially, in my opinion, given that low approval rate for skilled workers in the francophone category. I don't normally, I would be curious to see what percent of that is represented versus not. The people who I have done consultations with who have had refusals in the francophone category, it's actually almost all been the same issue, which is that their reference letter did not list duties. So just if you're applying under that category and the Canadian Experience class, it is extremely important to note that all of your reference letters supporting employment have to say the title of your position, the wage, whether it was full-time. Ideally, it would say the number of hours. Again, I think I said wage, what the time period was, and what your duties were. An IRCC is not under any obligation to request duties if they were not in the application. And I cannot stress that enough. It's like, I feel like I'm doing 1 or 2 consultations a week with people who want judicial review because they didn't put the duties, or they had a reference letter that didn't have the duties. There's no judicial review there. IRCC, the federal court has been clear that that's something that's clearly stated in the regulations as a requirement. And so therefore you have to include it. Deanna's had to just step aside, but I think what we will do, just looking at the time, is get into questions. We have had some coming through on both YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. I will address the first question. I'll do the Instagram questions first. 07 Ravi Teja asks, is there any chance for a CEC draw of 510 this year? I'm just going to assume that Ravi Teva is asking about a general draw instead of a category specific draw. I do not think it is likely. I've maintained this since our episode with Christopher Warwick, which was one of our more popular this year. And if you haven't heard that episode, it's titled The Economics of Deporting 1 Million People. He's an economist at, I believe, York or the University of Ottawa. I'm sorry, I got that. I didn't know that answer right off the top of my head, but he talked about how unless the economy greatly improved such that they could go deeper into the pool and increase immigration levels, that it was unlikely that points will come down. The economy is not getting better. For those who are watching, the unemployment rate is increasing. GDP growth has been minimal. Part of this is there are less people coming in, which has the impact of increasing GDP. And so certainly if the, well, I think this was either Mikal or Chris had said that, Christopher Warwick had said that what we expect based on this levels plan is that in the short term, Canada's GDP will go down, but over the long run, that should increase GDP per capita just because there will just be less people competing for the same jobs, which could have an upward pressure on wage. Naveen on Instagram asks, is there any chance for CEC draws going forward? The answer is yes. There's definitely going to be CEC draws going forward. We have on YouTube, we'll start off with frequent contributor who throws money to make comments. And as I've commented before, I don't necessarily understand what the comments are. But Christian says lies, damn lies, and statistics. In immigration, the most important number is the number, and number. Own house in order first. What I'll just comment on that is, I think it was, I don't remember if it was 2023 or 2024, that the department said that for the first time, they were going to start setting levels plans based on the economy, including housing. A lot of people, including myself, said, well, what was it based on before? It does seem to just be based on these top line numbers. A couple episodes ago, Deanna and I talked about the 2027 immigration levels consultation plan, which again basically was just like, so 400,000 in 2027. Is that too high, too low? Do you strongly agree, slightly disagree? So I still don't know what the overall levels are based on, beyond the most important element of statistics, which is politics, if you're a cynic like I am. Asma, hope I pronounced that right, said, is it an issue if a TFW works at a location other than the one listed on the work permit? The LMIA lists multiple locations, but his work permit lists only one. Service Canada confirmed that there are no compliance issues, but I'm not sure about IRCC. For context, the foreign worker is a paramedic and they work at different stations on demand. So I don't want to give legal advice on a podcast. Certainly, if you had a consultant or a lawyer help you, you should speak with them. What I will say is that in past issues or past situations where I have inquired about this directly with IRCC and CBSA, they have said that the work permit conditions will trump what is in an LMIA as far as the foreign worker is concerned. It could be, I mean, I was asking when I was asking these questions more in the compliance question, because we were asking what happens with an employer if their employee's work permit is different from what's in the LMIA. And it's a bit of a gray zone because of the good faith issue. In other words, like if an employer's non-compliance with, say, a work permit is based on good faith misinterpretation of the regulations, then their non-compliance can be found to be justified. There's not necessarily the same good faith justification for a foreign worker. But so, you know, I would just reach out to people for more specific context, because that is a difficult situation where a work permit has different conditions from what's in the LMIA. And it's frustrating when that happens. I know in my own practice, in my own corporate practice, we'll get the work permits amended. And I will say that like CBSA is pretty good at reprinting work permits if there is a mistake like that. What can get a little bit complicated is if the work permit application itself wasn't clear as to there being multiple locations, because then you have an issue where CBSA may say, well, this is an IRCC issue. So it all gets very complicated as to where the mistake was made.
Yeah.
You're back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
It is possible that my computer will bail on me, but but
Oh,
I
no
have
problem.
decided to take the risk.
I think, well, we're down to, I think, the last comment and question, which is from Ghosts of CBSA, fan of his Twitter account. If you're on Twitter, he's definitely worth following, or they, since they remain anonymous. The plummeting study permit approval is evidence of how poorly schools are vetting, fraudulent IELTS, etc. That could definitely be a cause of part of it. That being said, so I mean, I've seen through ATIPs, like I didn't realize before how many fraudulent acceptance letters there were from designated learning institutes. I was quite surprised to see, I shouldn't say fraudulent, from fraudulent acceptance letters from people who had obtained fake approval letters. I would have thought that the PAL system would have improved a lot of this vetting. And the decreasing approval rate, there may be a portion of that that's fraudulent IELTS. I don't, the reason I would say that I don't think it's the overwhelming majority is because those would be more misrep cases. And I don't think the misrep, I don't think that that drop in the approval rate of like 20-ish% has corresponded with a huge increase in misrep. And it's unclear what's going on because the refusal reasons, as Deanna can certainly attest, are just super vague Chinook refusal boilerplate where it's really actually impossible to know what is occurring behind the scenes beyond advanced analytics and the use of Chinook.
And it's so often like something that is like, uh, there's insufficient financial, evidence of financial means, and there are bank statements that show well in excess of what the financial thresholds are, like heaps of funds. And so it's really not at all responsive to the evidence in front of the officer. So it's certainly part of it. I don't in any way contest that there's poor vetting, and that also that a lot of the authorized schools should not have been authorized, at least historically. But yeah, I don't think it's a full answer, but point well taken for sure.
Yep. And then regarding the TRV refusal for the person attending the immigration division, just to be clear, it's visitor record refusal. I'm not surprised IRCC staff know nothing about enforcement. I mean, they like, I don't know, I'll take your word for it. You're retired IRCC CBSA, but I don't think a human read it. I don't think a human would have, I just don't think the application was read. I don't think that, or certainly it was not read in a way that the refusal reasons don't give any reason to believe that the application was read, as opposed to things being automatically pulled from the IMM 129, or no, the IMM 5708 application for a visitor record form, simply because every fact and factor listed in the refusal could have been pulled from a field on that form. And I don't believe that a human writes, you have had ample time to complete your purpose of visit, attending admissibility. I just don't believe that a human writes that.
Mm,
And if a
yeah.
human did
And
write
that
that, it's
same
worse than I
wording
think.
is so, yeah, yeah, yeah. We see that wording so often, like that boilerplate language.
Well, I mean, the big one that continues, which just drives me nuts, is that the purpose of air, I believe that I am not satisfied that the purpose of your visit is a temporary one, given the
Mhm.
details that you provided in your application, which do not show that it is temporary. And you're just like, what does it mean?
Yeah, 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 for sure.
Otherwise, that's all I think for today. Again, though, like Deanna was off when I said this, but like I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Like, prepare your applications as strong as you can. Have them reviewed if you want. I never directly recommend necessarily that people consult a lawyer or consultant, but um, I think for the federal skilled worker class, at least, there may be, as I said earlier, some merit to it, just because of that lower approval rate and because with every consult that I've done, it was immediately obvious what the issue was, and one that could have been avoided. So, and then again, throw in those requests that something be held in abeyance, because even if you
Yeah.
don't pursue judicial review, you're at least preserving the options.
Yeah,
And then we'll see.
exactly. And
Like I said,
extending your
2025 and 2026, the theme of the show was it would be difficult. We're 25% of the way through it.
Yeah.
As much as that's comfort to
Power
anyone.
on. Power on.
All right. Until next week.
Yes, indeed. Take care, everybody.